The anniversary card was still in my hands. 5th year. Embossed gold lettering. Ivory envelope sealed with a wax stamp. I'd pressed myself at 6 a.m. that morning, because I wanted everything to be perfect. The rooftop restaurant glowed 43 floors above Seoul. Crystal chandeliers throwing warm light across white tablecloths. The city's skyline bleeding neon and gold through floor-to-ceiling windows behind me. I had arrived early, reserved his favorite table, ordered the wine he liked before he even walked through the door. I sat straight, navy satin cool against my skin, hair falling in soft waves over one shoulder, hands folded in my lap, waiting. Then the elevator doors opened, and he walked in. Not alone. She was wearing red. Of course she was. Bold. Deliberate. A color that announces itself before the person does. She laughed at something he whispered near her ear. The kind of laugh meant to be seen, not heard. And when his hand found the small of her back, I felt the room tilt slightly beneath me. He guided her to my table, pulled out my chair, and she sat down in it, like she had always belonged there. I didn't move. I couldn't tell you why. Some part of me, the part that had ironed his shirts for 5 years, the part that had memorized how he took his coffee, the part that had planned this exact evening down to the floral arrangement, that part simply went very quiet. He finally looked at me, almost surprised I was still there. "You're early," he said, casual, like I was an inconvenience in his schedule. I set the anniversary card on the table, between the 2 wine glasses I had arranged for us. He didn't touch it. "You should be grateful I even showed up," he said, low enough that only I could hear, but loud enough that it landed exactly where he intended. I lowered my head, hands clasped tighter in my lap. If I looked up, I would break. And I refused to break in front of her red dress and his careless smile and every curious eye in that gleaming room. So I looked down, and I endured. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known in that moment, was that across the room, at a corner table near the window, a man had been watching since the moment I walked in. Not casually. Not the way people glance at a beautiful woman in a restaurant. Carefully. The way a person watches something they recognize as rare, and wrong, and worth intervening for. He was dressed in a charcoal 3-piece suit, crisp white shirt, a silver watch catching the chandelier light on one wrist. Tall, even-seated, sharply built. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm. It comes from control. His jaw was set. His dark eyes hadn't moved from our table in several minutes. Around him, his associates spoke in murmurs. Glasses were raised. Business was discussed. He heard none of it. Because my husband had just leaned across the table, refilled her glass first, and said something that made her laugh again. That same performed, weaponized laugh. While my anniversary card sat untouched between them, like evidence at a crime scene. The man in the charcoal suit set down his glass. Slowly. His chair scraped back, deliberate, unhurried, and he rose to his full height. Every person at his table went silent immediately. He straightened his cuff, and then he began to walk toward us. Each step measured, each step certain. The room didn't notice at first. Then it did. And by the time he stopped behind my chair and placed one hand on its back, not touching me, just claiming the space, the laughter at my table had already died. My husband looked up. For the first time that evening, something moved behind his eyes that wasn't arrogance. The man looked down at me, only briefly, quietly, like a question only I could answer. Then he looked at my husband and said, "You've embarrassed her enough." Not loud, not a threat, a verdict. Hello, my people, and welcome back to Hidden Love. This is where the stories your heart has been waiting for finally get told. the kind that begin in pain, but end in power. Tonight's story: a rooftop dinner, an anniversary turned into humiliation, and the most dangerous man in the room, deciding he's seen enough. Stay until the very end, because this story doesn't end in tears. It ends in a choice that changes everything. The restaurant was called Altitude. 43 floors above the city, perched at the crown of the Hanwha building, like something that had decided gravity was optional. The kind of place where reservations were made 6 weeks in advance, and the dress code was understood without being stated. Where the chandeliers were crystal, and the tablecloths were pressed linen, and the windows ran floor to ceiling on 3 sides, so that soul spread out below you like a living painting. All neon and amber, and the quiet crawl of headlights across the Han River Bridge. Irene Abba had booked the table 8 weeks ago. She had called twice to confirm. Had specified the corner table near the east window. The one with the best view of the city tower. The one where the light fell warmest at 8 p.m. She had requested the white rose centerpiece, because white was his favorite, not hers. Had pre-selected a wine she'd researched for 3 evenings on her laptop, cross-referencing vintage years and flavor notes until she found the one a sommelier on a food blog had described as the kind of bottle you open when the moment deserves to be remembered. She wanted the moment to be remembered. 5 years. Half a decade of a life built together. Shared mornings and grocery lists and disagreements about whose turn it was to call the landlord, and quiet Sunday evenings when the city outside went soft and the apartment felt like the whole world. 5 years of learning a person. Of choosing them again. Every morning. Even on the mornings when it wasn't easy. She had ironed her dress herself that afternoon, passing the iron slowly over the navy satin until it fell without a single crease. Had spent 40 minutes on her hair, coaxing it into the soft waves that fell over her left shoulder, the way she knew photographed beautifully. Small diamond studs in her ears, understated, deliberate. A thin gold bracelet on her right wrist. The one he had given her on their 2nd anniversary, back when gestures still meant something. She arrived at 7:45, 15 minutes early, because she had always been the kind of woman who respected a moment enough to be present for it before it began. The maitre d' recognized the reservation, led her through the warm hum of the restaurant, past tables of couples leaning close, past a long booth where a group of men in suits spoke in low tones over amber-filled glasses, past the soft live piano near the entrance that was playing something slow and barely there. He pulled out her chair with practiced grace and placed a single folded menu before her, and Irene settled into the velvet seat and looked out at the city, and felt, briefly, something close to peace. The anniversary card was already in her bag. She set it on the table to her left, beside the second wine glass, positioned so he would see it the moment he sat down. She ordered still water, checked her phone, no messages, smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her lap, watched the city lights below shift and breathe. She waited. 7:58, 8 o'clock, 8:14. At 8:22, the elevator at the far end of the restaurant opened, and her husband walked out. Irene smiled, the immediate, an involuntary smile of someone who had been waiting and now felt the waiting end. And she lifted her hand slightly, just enough to catch his eye across the room. He didn't look at her. He was already looking at the woman beside him. The woman in the red dress. Irene's hand lowered slowly back to the table. She told herself, in the 3 or 4 seconds it took them to cross the room toward her, that there was an explanation. A colleague. A client his company had invited last minute. Someone he'd run into in the lobby. Someone he felt obligated to bring upstairs, rather than leave waiting below. She told herself this because the alternative had not yet fully assembled itself in her mind. Because the mind, when it is about to be broken, takes its time arriving at the break. The woman in the red dress was laughing at something he'd said, and her hand was resting in the crook of his arm, not holding it, resting there, with the easy familiarity of someone who had done it many times before. She was beautiful in the way of women who know they are being watched. Chin slightly lifted, posture open, taking up space without apology. The dress was deep scarlet, low cut, chosen to announce. Her jewelry was bold where Irene's was quiet. Her laugh was full, where Irene's evening had gone silent. He reached the table. He did not look at the anniversary card. He did not look at the white roses. He looked at the empty chair across from Irene, the chair she had reserved for him, and he pulled it out. For her. The woman in the red dress murmured a small, sweet thank you and sat down in Irene's chair, like she had been expected, like she had been planned for, like she belonged precisely there, and Irene was the one who had arrived to the wrong table. Irene did not move. Her hands found each other beneath the table, fingers lacing together the way they did when she needed to hold something steady inside herself. Her husband finally looked at her. There was no guilt in it, no discomfort. Just a mild, almost bored acknowledgement. The look a man gives a piece of furniture he has decided to rearrange. He sat down in a chair he pulled from the neighboring table, settled into it sideways, relaxed, one arm draped across the back. "You're early," he said. 3 words. That was all. No apology threaded through them. No explanation offered. Just 3 words delivered like a mild observation about weather. Irene opened her mouth, closed it. In the 10 years she had known this man. 5 years of marriage. 5 years before that. She had never found herself entirely without words. She was not a woman who went quiet. She was precise, considered, occasionally sharp. She had argued with him across kitchen tables and made up with him in dark hallways and spoken truths to him that cost her something to say. But in this moment, the words simply were not there. They had packed themselves somewhere she couldn't reach. So she sat, upright, still, looking at the card she had sealed with wax at 6 a.m., which now sat between empty glasses at a table set for a celebration that had already been cancelled without her knowledge. The woman in the red dress, whose name Irene did not yet know and would not ask, reached for the wine list with the ease of someone settling into her own home. She tilted it toward Irene's husband with a small smile, pointing at something near the top of the page, and he leaned in close to read it, their heads nearly touching. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant, indifferent life. Glasses clinked. Conversations rose and fell. The piano played. The city glittered below. 34 stories of glass and ambition, and the quiet commerce of other people's evenings. Irene looked down at the table. Her hands were very still in her lap now. She was aware of the precise weight of her bracelet against her wrist. That second anniversary bracelet. And she thought, in a strange, dissociated way, that she should take it off. That it no longer meant what she had always told herself it meant. She didn't take it off. She just sat with the knowledge, the way you sit with pain, before you've fully decided what to do about it. Her husband ordered the wine without consulting her. A different bottle from the one she had pre-selected. She saw it when the sommelier presented the label, recognized it wasn't the one attached to the reservation notes she had left. He had simply chosen something else. Something they had apparently already discussed. The sommelier poured first for the woman in the red dress, then for her husband. Then, as a procedural afterthought, for Irene. She did not reach for her glass. The conversation across the table washed over her in pieces. She caught laughter, caught a fragment about a weekend away, somewhere she didn't recognize. Caught the particular sound of 2 people speaking with the comfortable shorthand of people who had been keeping a secret together for long enough that it no longer felt like one. And then, quietly, the way the worst things always happen, without announcement. Her husband leaned back in his chair, looked at Irene with something approaching patience, and said, "You should be grateful I even showed up." Low, measured. Delivered the way a man speaks when he has already decided the outcome of a conversation and is simply informing the other person of it. Irene's chin dropped. She looked at the table, at the white roses, at the anniversary card still sealed in its ivory envelope, its gold lettering catching the chandelier light. 5th year. She breathed in through her nose. Slow. Controlled. She would not cry. She had decided that before she even left the apartment that evening. Had made it a rule as she touched up her lipstick in the bathroom mirror. Had renewed it in the elevator on the way up. Had held it like a physical object through the 20 minutes of waiting. She would not cry in this restaurant, in this dress, in front of this woman in red who had taken her chair. She would simply endure. And then she would leave. She was already running the calculation. How long before she could stand without it seeming like a retreat? How she would hold her body as she walked toward the elevator? Whether she could reach the ground floor before the composure finally gave out? When the sound reached her, a chair scraping back, slow, unhurried. The kind of movement that is not made by accident. She didn't look up immediately. The sound came from behind her and to the right, from the direction of that long corner table near the window, the one she had passed on her way in, without registering. She had been too focused on the flowers, on the view, on the anticipation of an evening she had already begun rehearsing in her mind. She heard footsteps, not quick, not hesitant, measured. The footsteps of someone who had made a decision and was now simply executing it, without the need for speed, because certainty doesn't require rushing. The footsteps stopped behind her chair. She felt, before she saw, before she heard, a presence. The particular gravity of someone standing very close, very still, very deliberately. And then a hand came to rest on the back of her chair. Not on her shoulder, not touching her at all. Just on the chair, one hand, placed with quiet authority, claiming the space around her, the way a sentence claims a room when it is spoken by the right voice at the right moment. Irene finally looked up, and the man standing behind her was not someone you looked at once. He was tall in the way that had nothing to do with height. Tall the way authority is tall, the way stillness can be taller than movement. Dark charcoal suit, 3-piece, cut with the kind of precision that doesn't advertise itself. Crisp white shirt, a gray silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat. Silver watch on his left wrist, the only piece of jewelry, and it was not for show. His face was sharp-featured and composed, clean-jawed, dark eyes set beneath a calm brow. He was not looking at her. He was looking at her husband. And her husband, who had spent the last 40 minutes performing carelessness with practiced ease, had gone very, very still. The woman in the red dress had stopped laughing. The man standing behind Irene's chair didn't raise his voice, and didn't shift his weight, didn't do anything that could be described, technically, as threatening. He simply existed in the space behind her, with the absolute, unambiguous presence of someone whose stillness has weight. And he said, low, even, utterly final, "You've embarrassed her enough." 4 words. The restaurant didn't stop. The piano kept playing. The city kept glittering beyond the glass. But at this particular table, in this particular circle of candlelight, the air had changed its composition entirely. Irene's husband blinked. Once. Then his expression rearranged itself. The carelessness replaced by something she had never seen on his face before. Something she could only describe, later, as a man suddenly remembering that the world is larger than his own convenience. "Excuse me," her husband started, and the word coming out slightly thinner than he'd intended. "Do I know?" "No," the man behind her said simply. He moved then, not toward her husband, but around to the side of the table, placing himself in the space between Irene and the other two with the unhurried deliberateness of someone rearranging the terms of a situation. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. He simply stood, and the standing was enough. His eyes moved, briefly, carefully, to Irene. There was something in that look she couldn't immediately name. Not pity, not calculation. Something quieter than both. The look of someone who has been watching for long enough to understand what they're seeing. Then he looked back at her husband, and he began to speak. He didn't shout. He didn't perform. He simply laid things down on the table, fact by fact, the way a man empties his pockets when he has decided he is done carrying the weight. The timeline came first. Dates that meant nothing to the room, but meant everything to Irene. A business trip in October that had lasted 4 days longer than scheduled. A conference in Busan she had accepted as routine. A Thursday evening, 3 months ago, when her husband had come home at midnight, smelling of a perfume she didn't recognize. And she had told herself she was imagining things because it was easier than the alternative. She hadn't been imagining things. He spoke about the financial arrangements next. Quietly, without emphasis, the way accountants speak about numbers. The accounts she didn't know existed. The money moved in increments small enough not to trigger questions. The lease on an apartment in Mapo District, signed 11 months ago, under a name that wasn't her husband's, but might as well have been. Her husband said nothing. The woman in red had gone very still, her glass still raised halfway to her lips, forgotten there. And then, last and most quietly, the man said, "The dinner wasn't an accident. You planned to replace her publicly. You needed witnesses." He said it without inflection, as simple as weather, as damning as evidence. Irene heard a sound and realized, distantly, that it had come from her. Not a cry, not a word, just a small exhale of air, the kind the body releases when it has been holding something for a very long time, and finally receives permission to let it go. She looked at the anniversary card still sitting on the table. She thought about 6 a.m. She thought about the wax seal. She thought about the sommelier pouring her wine last, as an afterthought. She thought about 5 years. The man turned to her then. Not fully, just enough. A slight shift of weight, a fractional turn of his head, like a question offered quietly in a room full of noise. "You don't have to stay at this table," he said. "Not you should leave. Not let me take you out of here. Just, you don't have to stay. Permission." That was what it was. Spoken to a woman who had spent the last hour granting everyone around her permission to take up space, while she made herself smaller and smaller, in navy satin, with her hands clasped, and her head down, and her anniversary card sealed and untouched. Irene looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table, picked up the anniversary card, stood. Her posture, when she rose, was not the posture of someone leaving in defeat. Her shoulders were level. Her chin was lifted. The navy satin fell clean and unbroken to the floor, and the soft waves of her hair fell over her shoulder, and her small diamond earrings caught the chandelier light as she turned from the table. She didn't look at her husband. She didn't look at the woman in red. She looked forward, and she walked. Behind her, she heard the man in the charcoal suit settle into the chair she had just vacated. Not her husband's borrowed chair, not the woman's claimed seat, but the one that had simply been hers. She heard him speak again, lower now, to her husband, in a tone that suggested the conversation that followed was not one she needed to stay for. She crossed the restaurant without hurrying, past the tables of couples leaning close, and past the piano, still playing its soft, indifferent melody, past the maître d', who saw her expression and said nothing, because some moments require nothing said. She reached the elevator, pressed the button, stood in the small quiet of the alcove, looking at the card in her hands. The gold lettering, the ivory envelope, the wax seal she had pressed herself in a kitchen that now felt like someone else's. 5th year. She ran her thumb across the seal. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside, turned around, and through the warm light of the restaurant, across 40 feet of white tablecloths and crystal, and the beautiful, indifferent city behind the glass, she saw the man in the charcoal suit. He was still at the table, still speaking. But his eyes had found her. Just for a moment, and across the distance, and the light, and everything that had just happened. And in them was the same quiet thing she had seen before. Not pity. Recognition. The doors closed, and Irene Abba descended 43 floors with the anniversary card held against her chest, and the first tears finally, quietly, finding their way down her face. Not because she was broken, but because she was, at last, allowed to feel it. The lobby of the Hanwha building was cold. Not the pleasant cool of air conditioning against a warm evening. Cold in the way of spaces that were designed for movement, not staying. Marble floors and high ceilings, and the particular echo of heels on stone that makes a person feel very small and very alone simultaneously. Irene stood near the revolving doors, the anniversary card still in her hands, the city visible through the glass in fragments. A taxi pulling away, a couple walking close together under the amber glow of a street lamp. The ordinary world continuing its ordinary business, completely indifferent to what had just occurred 43 floors above it. She had stopped crying somewhere between the 31st and 22nd floor. Not because she had resolved anything, not because the pain had organized itself into something manageable, but because the tears had simply run their course for now, the way a storm exhausts itself without the sky fully clearing. And what remained afterward was something quieter and harder. A stillness that felt less like peace and more like the moment after an earthquake when you are checking, methodically, what is still standing. She was still standing. That was something. She became aware of the lobby attendant watching her from his desk, with the careful, non-intrusive concern of someone trained to notice without intervening. She straightened slightly, almost by instinct, the same reflex that had kept her spine straight at that table for 40 humiliating minutes, and moved toward the seating area near the window. A low curved bench, upholstered in charcoal gray. She sat, placed the card on her knee, looked at it. She had spent 3 evenings choosing it, had stood in the stationery aisle of a shop on Insadong Street, reading the printed sentiments inside various cards, and finding them all insufficient, until she found one that was blank inside, just the embossed cover, and decided she would write it herself. Had drafted the words twice in her notebook, before committing them to the card in her good handwriting, the careful cursive she only used for things that mattered. She hadn't opened it since she sealed it. She opened it now. Her own handwriting looked back at her. 12 sentences. She read them in the cold marble lobby, alone, and when she finished, she closed the card again and set it face down on the bench beside her. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she heard the elevator. She knew before she looked up. There was something in the sound of it. Not the elevator itself, but the quality of the silence that followed its arrival. The particular stillness of the lobby, in the 2 seconds between the doors opening and the footsteps beginning, and the kind of stillness that precedes the entrance of someone the room instinctively reorganizes itself around. She looked up. He crossed the lobby without hurrying, his charcoal suit jacket buttoned, hands at his sides, eyes finding her immediately. Not searching. Finding, as if he had already known exactly where she would be. He stopped a few feet away. Didn't sit. Didn't crowd her space. Just stood at a respectful distance, the way a person stands when they are offering presents without demanding anything in return. For a moment, Neither of them spoke. She studied him the way she hadn't been able to upstairs. Properly, without the distortion of shock and humiliation, narrowing everything to tunnel vision. He was younger than she had initially registered. Mid-30s, perhaps. And the sharpness of his features was less severe at closer range and more simply precise. A face that missed nothing, that processed everything, that had learned a long time ago that the world rewards those who pay attention. His expression was difficult to read. Not cold, not warm exactly. Somewhere in the careful middle of a man who has trained himself not to broadcast his interior. "You didn't need to follow me," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "No," he agreed simply. "I didn't." She looked at him for another moment. "Then why did you?" He considered the question. Not performing consideration, actually doing it. Taking the few seconds it deserved before answering. "Because you left your wine," he said. She stared at him. Something moved across his face then. The briefest softening at the corner of his mouth, and there and gone so quickly, she might have constructed it. And she understood that this was his version of lightness. That this was, for this particular man, a joke. And despite everything, despite the red dress and the pulled-out chair and the anniversary card she had just read alone in a lobby, she felt something loosen fractionally in her chest. Not laughter. Not yet. But the memory of it. "I didn't feel much like drinking," she said. "No," he said. "I don't imagine you did." He moved then. A slight gesture toward the bench. A question without words. She shifted the anniversary card and he sat, leaving enough space between them that it felt considered. He rested his forearms on his knees, looked at the revolving doors, and for a while they simply sat in the strange, suspended quiet of two people who have just passed through the same fire from opposite directions. "How long have you known?" she asked eventually. She wasn't sure why she was asking him. She wasn't sure why it felt natural to ask him. This man whose surname she didn't know, whose presence in her evening had arrived without invitation and rearranged everything. He turned his head slightly toward her. "Long enough," he said, "that I was sorry I hadn't said something sooner." She absorbed this. "You were watching me." "I was watching the table," he said, careful, honest. "You arrived and arranged everything. The card, the glasses, the flowers. And then you sat and waited. And there was something in the way you waited." He paused briefly. "You were hoping. That was what I noticed. Not the dress, not the setting. And the hoping." Irene looked down at her hands. "And then he walked in," she said quietly. "And then he walked in," he confirmed. "And I watched you decide, in about 4 seconds, to endure it rather than fracture. And I thought..." Another pause. "That was either the strongest thing I'd ever seen, or the saddest, and I couldn't determine which." The revolving doors turned. A couple entered, laughing, shaking light rain from their coats. She hadn't noticed it had begun to rain. They moved through the lobby without looking at the two people on the bench near the window, trailing the smell of wet pavement and autumn air behind them. Irene watched them go. "Both," she said. "It was both." "Yes," he said. "I know." His name, he told her, was Soong Jin. He offered it the way he seemed to offer everything. Plainly, without performance, as a simple piece of information being transferred to someone he had decided deserved accurate information. She told him her name. He repeated it once, quietly, as if placing it somewhere careful. She didn't ask what he did. She already understood, in the vague, instinctive way you understand weather, before you've checked the forecast, that the version he would offer in a hotel lobby would be abbreviated. She understood it from the way his associates upstairs had gone silent when he stood, from the way her husband's carelessness had evaporated the instant Soong Jin positioned himself at that table. From the way the maitre d' had watched him cross the restaurant, with the particular attentiveness of a man who knew exactly who he was serving, and wanted there to be no cause for complaint. And there were things about Sung Jin that would require more than one evening to understand. She found, sitting beside him in the cold lobby, with the rain beginning to tap softly against the glass, that she was not frightened by this. She thought she probably should be. She wasn't. He planned it, she said. Not a question. She had been turning the words he'd spoken upstairs over in her mind since the elevator. You planned to replace her publicly. You needed witnesses. And with every turn, they settled more completely into the shape of a truth she had been refusing to let herself look at directly for longer than tonight. Yes, Sung Jin said. The dinner was never for me. No. She breathed out slowly through her nose. How long have you known him? We've intersected, he said carefully. In certain business matters. And long enough for me to understand what kind of man he is. A pause. Long enough to have seen the pattern before tonight. She turned to look at him directly. The things you said upstairs, the account, the apartment, all verifiable, he said, meeting her eyes without flinching. I wouldn't have said them otherwise. She held his gaze. There was something in this man that she was still learning to read, still finding the edges of. He operated in a register she wasn't entirely familiar with. Precise, economical, stripped of the social performances most people kept running at all times. He didn't reassure unnecessarily. He didn't soften what didn't need softening. He simply told the truth with the quiet confidence of someone who had decided, at some point in his life, that honesty was the only currency worth carrying. And she found it, unexpectedly, sitting in the wreckage of her 5th anniversary, almost restful. Why did you say I was under your protection? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Because you needed to leave that table, he said, and he needed a reason to let you. That was strategy. Partly. And the other part? He looked at the revolving doors. The other part, he said, is a longer conversation. The rain was proper now, running in thin rivers down the glass. The city beyond softened and blurred into impressions of light, amber and white, and the distant red of a signal tower, blinking its patient rhythms somewhere across the river. Irene looked at the anniversary card, still face down on the bench between them. She thought about the 12 sentences she had written in her careful cursive, and the hopes she had pressed into them, like flowers between pages. She thought about how certain she had been, sealing that envelope this morning, that the person she had written them for deserved them. She picked the card up, and without entirely deciding to, she held it out to Sung Jin. He looked at it, then at her. You don't have to. I know, she said. I want to. He took it carefully, opened it, read it, all of it, slowly, the way the words deserved to be read even if they had been written for the wrong person to receive. When he finished, he closed it, held it for a moment. You write the way you carry yourself, he said. How is that? With more grace than the situation requires. She looked at him. She thought about 5 years of making herself smaller. 5 years of arranging flowers, and selecting wine, and ironing dresses, and writing careful words into blank cards for a man who had been measuring her exit for at least 11 of those months, possibly more. 5 years of a particular kind of invisibility that is worse than being unseen by strangers. The invisibility of being unseen by someone who was supposed to be looking directly at you. She thought about Sung Jin watching from across the room, watching the hoping. I stayed too long, she said. Not to him exactly. To the rain, to the marble floor, to the version of herself that had pressed that wax seal this morning with such deliberate, heartbreaking faith. Yes, he said. But you left at exactly the right moment. She looked at him. How do you know when it's the right moment? When you stand up, he said simply, and your spine remembers itself. She thought about the way she had risen from that chair. Shoulders level, chin up, the navy satin falling clean. Yes, that was exactly what it had felt like. She called for her car at 10:45. They had moved, somewhere in the preceding hour, from the bench to a small seating alcove further from the doors, where a server from the lobby bar had appeared and left 2 cups of tea without being asked, which told her something more about who Sung Jin was in this building, in this city, in whatever architecture of power he occupied. She had drunk the tea, and he had not, and they had talked about things that were not the dinner, not her husband, not the red dress, small, sideways things, the way people talk when they are establishing the frequency of each other's thinking, checking whether the channels match. They matched, she found, in the particular way that surprises you. Not perfectly, not without friction, but genuinely. The way 2 people match when they have both spent time inside difficulty and come out on the other side with their sense of humor and their standards still intact. When her car arrived, he walked with her to the doors. They stood in the threshold, the revolving glass separating the warm lobby from the wet city, and she looked at him in the particular light of a night that had remade itself entirely from what it had promised to be. I didn't need you to save me, she said. She needed him to know this. It mattered that he knew this. I know, he said, without hesitation, without injury. I didn't. Then what did you do? He looked at her for a long moment. I saw you, he said. That's all. I just made sure you knew someone had. Irene stood with that. It was such a small thing to say. It was the largest thing anyone had said to her in 5 years. She stepped through the revolving doors into the rain-washed night, and the city air touched her face. Cool, clean, carrying the smell of wet stone and distant river. And she walked to the car waiting at the curb. At the door she turned. He was still standing in the light of the lobby, hands in his pockets, watching her the way he had watched her across the restaurant. Not casually, not with possession, but with the careful, steady attention of someone who has decided that a thing has value and intends to keep knowing it. She held his gaze across the rain and the light and the distance. Then she got into the car, and as it pulled away from the curb and joined the slow river of Seoul's nighttime traffic, past the lit towers and the rain-blurred storefronts and the ordinary, extraordinary city carrying on, Irene Abba sat with the anniversary card in her lap and her head resting against the cool glass of the window. And she thought about what it meant to be seen. Not saved. Seen. She had spent 5 years trying to be loved by a man who had been looking through her. She had spent one evening being witnessed by a stranger who had looked directly at her and understood, without being told, exactly what he was looking at. The car moved through the city. The rain tapped the glass. She didn't cry again. She made a decision instead. And decisions, she had always believed, were the one thing that belonged entirely to you. The one act that no one could pull out from under you, like a chair at a table you had reserved and decorated and arrived early for. She turned the card over in her hands. 5th year. She thought, the 6th will be different. Not because someone would rescue her into it, because she would walk into it herself. Eyes open, spine remembered, choosing only what was worth choosing. And perhaps, not yet, not tonight, but perhaps, choosing who was worth choosing too. The city lights slid past the window like something being slowly, finally, released.